The chandelier light fractured into golden shards above me as I stood in the center of the Lockwood Regency's grand hall, pretending the 200 glittering strangers around me weren't stealing side glances at the other Hartley daughter. The scent of peonies, champagne, and expensive perfume clung to the air like a silk veil stretched too tight. My sister Camille floated down the marble staircase in a gown that sparkled like fresh ice, and for a moment the entire room gasped as if witnessing royalty. But the gasp wasn't what froze me. It was my mother. Evelyn Hartley, radiant in silver satin, lifted her glass toward me right as the spotlight followed Camille onto the stage. Her smile sharpened like a blade. "So Ava, sweetheart, when's your turn?" the music stuttered. Someone near me coughed. A few guests exchanged amused, pitying glances. Camille's lips curled into a soft, polished smirk she'd spent 26 years perfecting. Even the orchestra seemed to pause as if waiting to hear whether I would crumble the way everyone expected. I didn't. I didn't blush, didn't shrink, didn't lower my head. Instead, I set my glass gently on the white linen tablecloth and smiled, small, steady, controlled. If they wanted an answer tonight, I could give them one that would make this entire hall forget how to breathe. I turned slightly, letting the smile settle on my face like armor. Not yet, I thought. Not here. Not until the moment was right. But the spark had already caught. I walked away from the center of the hall, weaving between floral arches and clusters of guests whispering behind jeweled hands. My shoes clicked softly against the marble floor, each step tugging a thin thread of memory loose inside me. I found a sliver of quiet near the ornate mirror by the side corridor and let myself breathe. In the reflection, I looked perfectly composed, hair-smooth dress, flawless shoulders relaxed. But beneath that, something churned, something old, something that had been waiting. A woman in a navy gown passed behind me, whispering to her friend, "That must be the sister they never talk about." Her voice wasn't cruel. Worse, she sounded genuinely curious. I exhaled slowly, keeping my face still. Of course they never talked about me, not the way they talked about Camille. The crowd erupted again as Camille reached the bottom of the staircase. The lights caught the crystals on her gown, sending ripples of brilliance across the room. Evelyn dabbed at her eyes dramatically. Douglas, my father, stood straighter, beaming, with the pride he'd never once aimed in my direction. The perfect Hartley family. Or at least the version they liked to present to the world. I stepped back into the hall, letting myself be carried by the current of chiffon skirts and tailored tuxedos. I spotted my name on the seating chart again, scribbled in a noticeably different handwriting than the surrounding names, as if added last minute. My seat, the outer ring, near the distant relatives and +1 section. Camille's friends floated past me, laughing like they were breathing helium. "She looks tense," one murmured. "Well, wouldn't you be?" another replied. "Showing up alone to your sister's luxury wedding alone. If only they knew." I touched my hand to the side of my dress, where beneath the silk, a thin chain held a ring warm against my skin. Just a moment. Just a reminder of what the world didn't know yet. Preston, the groom, caught sight of me from across the room. For a second, his expression shifted concern, confusion, recognition of something wrong before he masked it again under practiced calm. The ceremony music faded, and guests were guided to their seats for the first set of speeches. I slipped into mine and folded my napkin across my lap, watching Camille glide to the center like a swan bathed in spotlight. Evelyn stood beside her for the opening toast. "My beautiful daughter," she began, her voice angelic, has always had impeccable grace. She knows how to do things properly. She didn't look at me. She didn't need to. The implication hit like a familiar slap. I steadied myself with a sip of water. Camille performed her gratitude speech flawlessly, her voice soft, her smile adoring, her eyes glassy with perfectly timed emotion. Guests sighed. Someone whispered, "She's so elegant," behind me. Camille soaked it in like she needed it to live. Then her bridesmaids stepped forward. One of them, Celeste, accidentally let her stage smile slip as she glanced past Camille toward me. "I guess the aesthetic stayed clean," she muttered to the girl beside her. My chest tightened. What aesthetic? Then I knew. They hadn't wanted me in any of the planning photos, any of the pre-wedding events, any of the memories. I folded my hands together beneath the tablecloth. If they thought erasing me made their picture look cleaner, they were going to regret it. Suddenly, Preston appeared beside my table. He leaned down just enough that only I could hear him. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "You look like you're carrying something heavy tonight." I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I whispered, "Not tonight." He nodded slowly, like he understood there was something larger, moving beneath the surface, something that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the people he was marrying into. A clink of glass echoed through the hall as Evelyn stepped back up to the microphone, lifting her champagne flute. Her expression was serene, but her eyes gleamed with triumph. "And now," she said, "with one daughter beautifully married." She turned toward me smiling as though she'd rehearsed the moment. "We all have just one question left." My stomach dropped, but not with fear, with recognition. I braced myself. Evelyn's voice floated across the hall like a lace-edged dagger. "When's your turn, Ava?" A hush fell so thick it smothered the room. Camille pretended to gasp, pressing a hand to her chest. Douglas glared at me with a warning so sharp it could cut. A few guests stifled giggles. Others whispered, "Oh dear." I inhaled once. Just once. Then I placed my napkin down, rose enough that my voice could travel, and let the same calm smile touch my lips. They had no idea the ground beneath them was already shifting. I met Evelyn's gaze. I didn't shake. I didn't blink. "I already had my turn," I said softly. Gasps rippled through the hall, but I kept smiling. They wanted a moment to humiliate me. Instead, I gave them the first crack in the perfect mirror they'd spent years polishing. And this time, I wasn't the one who was going to shatter. I found the hallway just outside the ballroom and leaned my palms against the cool wall, letting the hum of the wedding reception fade behind me. My heartbeat hadn't slowed since the moment Evelyn asked that question, the one she'd been sharpening for years. "When's your turn?" My turn had come and gone. My family just never showed up. For a moment, I stared at my reflection in a gold-framed mirror hanging beside the exit sign. I looked put together, polished, like someone who belonged in that glittering ballroom. But looks had always been the easiest part. It was everything underneath the ache, the history, the choices I could feel, shifting like plates beneath a fault line. A pair of guests walked past on their way to the restrooms. One of them, a woman in emerald satin, whispered to the other, "That must be the older sister." The other replied, "The one who wasn't at her own wedding rite." They didn't even lower their voices. I turned my face slightly so the mirror wouldn't catch the tremor in my jaw. I wasn't supposed to hear that. But people always assumed I was harmless or invisible or both. They weren't wrong, at least not until now. I stepped away from the wall needing air, but the hallway was lined with towering calla lilies and satin drapes, making everything feel too curated, too suffocating. I walked deeper in until the noise from the ballroom faded to a dull pulse behind me. My thoughts pulled themselves backward, unspooling toward the moment this all began, the day I planned a wedding my family never intended to attend. The memory rose gently at first, then cut sharply clean as glass. Denver, early spring. The small kitchen in the house I shared with Lucas was filled with warm lamplight and the smell of fresh eucalyptus from the bouquets we'd been assembling. My wedding dress hung in the next room, simple and soft, nothing like Camille's show-stopping crystal spectacle tonight. My fingers had been smudged with gold leaf from sealing invitation, envelopes cotton paper thick enough to feel like a promise when you held it. I'd chosen each detail with the care of someone trying to build a memory that would last forever. Lucas walked in, barefoot, coffee mug in hand. "You've been at this for hours," he said, smiling that quiet smile of his that always made me exhale. "Are you sure you don't want to call them first?" I tied a velvet ribbon around the final invitation and smoothed the bow until it sat perfectly. "They're my parents," I said. "They wouldn't miss this." Even then, the sentence felt strangely fragile coming out of my mouth. He leaned his shoulder against the counter and watched me slip the last invitation into a blue FedEx envelope. "You always hope for the best," he murmured. "I admire that." I sealed the flap and pressed the adhesive down. "It's family," I said simply. "They'll come." But the truth was, I'd been telling myself that same line since childhood. Ever since the days Evelyn would cancel our mother-daughter weekends to help Camille rehearse a piano recital or attend another charity brunch. Ever since Douglas would forget to show up to my art exhibitions but somehow always make it to Camille's tennis matches. I'd been talking myself into hope for years. The next morning I stood at the FedEx counter with shaky hands as the clerk weighed the envelopes. He glanced at the addresses, then at me. "Just the one state?" he asked. I smiled too brightly. "Just the people who raised me." He dropped the packages into the bin, scanned the labels, and said, "They'll have them tomorrow morning." I thanked him and walked out into the crisp Colorado air, hopeful enough to ache. The wedding day came quicker than expected. Lucas and I decorated the venue with strings of warm lights draped above a wooden archway that smelled faintly of pine. My best friend arranged flowers on each table, simple arrangements of white tulips and sage greenery. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but it was ours. 2 chairs in the front row sat empty, each with a hand-painted sign, reserved for Mom and reserved for Dad. I decorated those signs myself, brushing daisies across the edges, because Evelyn once mentioned she liked them. I thought she'd smile when she saw. When the ceremony start time arrived, I didn't panic. Not yet. Maybe they were late. Maybe their flight was delayed. Maybe they were parking. I delayed the ceremony 30 minutes, guests whispered. Lucas kept squeezing my hand. "We can wait longer," he said softly. But something inside me had already begun to cool, freezing from the inside out. When I finally shook my head and said no, let's start, a small, sharp crack formed in my chest. It didn't break me. Not then. But I felt the first tear in a very old seam. After the ceremony, when guests hugged us and my friend wiped tears from her cheeks, I kept glancing at my phone, waiting for something, anything from my parents. A missed call. A text. An apology. Nothing. Just silence. A hard echoing kind. Weeks passed. Then, months. No explanation. No acknowledgement. Camille posted a story of herself at brunch that very day, laughing with a mimosa in hand. Evelyn commented with heart emojis. Neither said a single word about missing my wedding. And then the FedEx notification arrived. Proof of delivery, the email read. When I opened it, the photo popped up, grainy but unmistakable. A looping signature, C. Hartley. Camille's handwriting. Signed at 9:16 a.m., the day before my wedding. I remember sitting at my kitchen table staring at that signature. My pulse stilled. They hadn't forgotten. She hadn't forgotten. She'd received it. She'd just chosen not to come. I closed my eyes in the hallway of the Lockwood Regency, pulling myself back into the present. Back into the hall where my sister's wedding glittered like a crown made of ice. If Camille thought burying the truth 8 months ago would make it disappear, she'd forgotten something vital. Truth is soil. The deeper you bury it, the harder it pushes to the surface. I stepped back into the ballroom just as Camille took her place at the front for the next series of speeches. Light cascaded over her dress. Guests lifted their phones to record. Evelyn hovered at the edge of the stage, glowing with pride, as though she'd personally sculpted her daughter out of marble. No one looked at me. No one wondered where I'd gone. I'd slipped out of their narrative too easily, just like always. But Preston caught my eye. He didn't smile. He didn't look away. His gaze held questions he hadn't had time to form yet. Soon, I thought. I slid into my chair. The velvet napkin lay where I'd left it folded with crisp edges. The hum of conversation dulled into something distant and hollow. The air felt tight like it had been stretched too far. I touched the place on my dress where the chain lay beneath the fabric, the ring warm against my skin. Not tonight, I told myself again, but soon. All around me, Camille sparkled. All around me, people cheered. And for the first time in my life, buried under humiliation, under silence, under 8 months of unanswered questions, something inside me steadied cold, clear, and final. They didn't forget my wedding, they erased it. And tonight, whether they wanted to or not, they were going to remember. Every single piece. The cold Newport air hit me the moment I stepped out of the packed ballroom. Even with the heaters lining the corridor and the glow of string lights draped along the terrace, the air here felt different, sharper, thinner, like it had been waiting 8 months to cut into me again. I wrapped my shawl tighter around my shoulders and started down the long hall toward the estate's porte cochere, the place where every Hartley event began and ended. Coming home had never been easy. Coming back for Camille's wedding felt like willingly walking into a fire I had already burned in once. The chauffeur stationed near the entry doors nodded politely as I passed. "Miss Hartley," he said, straightening, "your family mentioned you'd be arriving alone tonight." I forced a polite smile. Of course they did. The hallway opened into the foyer of the Hartley estate's private wing, the area my parents often reserved for family business during large events. Even now, through the glass wall, I could see silhouettes moving inside sharp suits, stiff postures hands, slicing the air in heated negotiations. Douglas loved sealing deals in the middle of parties. Evelyn loved telling people he did. Family first, the plaques on the wall said. Family first, as long as it was convenient. I pushed the door open and stepped into the grand foyer lined with framed oil portraits. Hartley ancestors stared down at me as though I'd never measured up to any of them, and perhaps never would. Camille's photo from her graduation ceremony stood on a gold easel near the stairs, large as life. Mine not here. Not displayed. Not missed. Funny how a house could still feel familiar, yet no longer feel like home. A soft shuffle of footsteps echoed above me. "Ava," a timid voice asked. It was Lila, the housekeeper who'd worked here since I was 9. She stood halfway down the staircase holding a stack of folded linens. "You're back," she said with a surprised, almost relieved smile. "I didn't think you'd actually come." Her honesty hit harder than she intended. "Neither did I admitted." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Miss Camille, she told everyone you probably wouldn't show. Said you were too busy, or that you might stay away." There was a flicker of embarrassment in her eyes, as if she regretted repeating it. But I appreciated the truth. It was more than my own family gave me. "I'm here now," I said simply. Lila nodded, stepping closer. "I'm glad. The house feels different when you're here. Warmer." She pressed her lips together, lowering her voice even more. "You deserve better than how they talk about you." A lump pushed at my throat, not sorrow, but the ache of long unmet validation. Before I could respond, a door slammed somewhere deeper in the house. Douglas emerged from the study, his tie-loosened face flushed with agitation. He paused when he saw me, his expression shifting from stress to annoyance. "Ava, there you are." As if I'd already inconvenienced him, simply by existing. He strode over, rubbing his forehead. "I hope you're not planning to stir anything up tonight. We have Sterling Lockwood executives present. This merger is the largest deal I've ever negotiated." "I'm not here for your merger," I said quietly. He exhaled sharply. "Then be a team player and stay out of the spotlight." There it was, the old familiar command. Don't be loud. Don't be seen. Don't upset the perfect picture Camille needs. The same command that kept them from attending my wedding in the first place. Douglas moved past me toward the kitchen entrance, already dismissing me. But Lila stayed on the steps, watching, worry softening her features. "I know what happened," she whispered when Douglas disappeared. "I saw the invitations, the ones that never made it upstairs. My breath caught. You what? She paled. I didn't look inside. But the FedEx package, it was in the side foyer one morning. Then later that afternoon I saw it in the recycling bin outside, still sealed. I thought maybe your parents had asked Camille to sort the mail. My chest tightened. They didn't. I know now. Her eyes softened with guilt. I should have said something earlier. You couldn't have known, I said gently. None of this is on you. But inside the truth sharpened. Camille hadn't just ignored my wedding invitations. She'd thrown them away deliberately, carefully, with intention. The hallway felt smaller all of a sudden, like the walls were inching closer. I thanked Lila and continued toward the guest wing where my childhood room waited. When I pushed open the door, a familiar wave of lavender and cedar wafted out. The room looked exactly as I left it years ago. Cream bedspread, floral wallpaper, the bookshelf filled with novels I loved before I learned to hide the hobbies Camille mocked. I stepped inside and turned on the lamp. Something felt wrong, off. Not dangerous, just unsettling. It took me a few seconds to realize what it was. A cardboard box sat on the dresser, medium-sized, untouched. My handwriting stared back at me from the top flap. Ava and Lucas Hale, 38, Linden Court, Denver, CO. The return label from my wedding gifts. The box my parents were supposed to open 8 months ago. My stomach hollowed. I traced a finger over the ink. The edges were crisp, unbent, untouched by anyone since the day I shipped it. A wedding gift from me to them, unopened, gathering dust in the house where they never mentioned my marriage. A surge of heat washed over me, anger, grief, disbelief, all three knotted together. A tap sounded from the doorframe. Preston. He leaned a shoulder against the door, hands in his pockets. I figured you might be in here, he said softly. I blinked. Most people avoid this wing, he gave a half smile. Most people also didn't watch your mother ask that question in front of 200 guests. I didn't respond. He stepped inside, glancing around at the room, frozen in time. You grew up here, he murmured. I can see why you look uncomfortable tonight. I swallowed. It's not the wedding, or the crowd. It's them, he said quietly. I didn't deny it. Preston stepped closer to the dresser, eyes landing on the unopened wedding box. He frowned. A gift you sent them, I nodded, and they never opened it. His voice held something dark. Something protective. I shook my head. For a long moment he didn't say anything. Then Ava, what really happened? His voice dropped. Between you and your family. My pulse stuttered. This wasn't the time. Or the place. But his question cracked something open in me, gently, not forcefully, as if he wasn't demanding the truth, but offering space for it. Still, I exhaled and turned away. You'll know soon enough. He studied me a moment longer, then nodded, accepting my boundary. You shouldn't be alone in this house tonight, he said quietly. I've been alone in this house my whole life, I answered, not bitter, just honest. His expression tightened. You don't deserve that. Before either of us could say anything else, a shout echoed from the main hall, a sharp, irritated bark that belonged unmistakably to Douglas. Ava, we're starting the next program. Get back in there. Preston's jaw clenched. He shouldn't speak to you like that. He never learned any other way, I said. I walked past Preston and toward the hall. Before stepping through the door, I looked back and found him watching me, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Back in the main corridor, the music swelled again. Guests were returning to their seats. Laughter floated in artificial bursts, light and brittle. I stood at the edge of the entrance and let the noise roll over me like a wave I'd already survived once before. Tonight wasn't supposed to be about me, but the truth had its own timeline. I breathed in, felt my spine straighten, my heartbeat settle. The pieces were falling into place, not because I forced them, but because they had waited too long to stay buried. Lila's voice, the unopened box, the FedEx signature, the seating chart in different handwriting. All breadcrumbs leading toward the moment when everything would finally come together. The moment the Hartley family's perfect little narrative would crack. I stepped back inside the ballroom. They could ignore my wedding. They could erase the invitations. They could pretend I didn't exist. But they couldn't stop the truth from arriving. Not tonight. Not anymore. The ballroom had transformed in the short time I'd been gone. The lights dimmed to a warm gold, the orchestra shifted into a slow romantic waltz, and rows of champagne flutes sparkled beneath the chandeliers like a sea of tiny stars. It should have felt magical. Instead, the air felt tight, too tight, like the walls had leaned closer to listen. The wedding planner's headset crackled as she rushed by me, but she avoided eye contact. The assistant trailing behind her did the same, whispering. That's the sister, as though I couldn't hear. As though I was an exhibit. I exhaled slowly and stepped farther into the hall. Every detail of Camille's wedding had been curated to perfection: clear acrylic chairs, white hydrangea walls, floating candles lining the aisle, a four-tiered cake with edible silver leaf. Everything gleamed, everything shimmered, everything screamed money and status. Camille stood in the center of it, all radiant in her crystal-embroidered gown, posing for photos with her new in-laws. Her smile was the kind of smile you practiced, not the kind you felt. When she caught sight of me near the back of the room, her expression didn't falter, but her eyes flickered sharp and calculating. Just a few feet away, Evelyn hovered like a queen presiding over her court. She waved to guests with a gracious tilt of her wrist, whispering to them about Camille's impeccable taste and her perfect match with Preston. Every person she spoke to nodded enthusiastically, confirming the narrative she worked so hard to maintain. Guests were ushered to their seats as the next segment of the program began. I slipped quietly into my assigned chair at the far edge of the room, one seat away from a column that partially blocked my view of the stage. It was a table of distant cousins and vague acquaintances, the kind of table you use for people you don't care to include, but feel obligated not to exclude. A woman beside me leaned toward her husband. Is that her, the older one? He gave me a glance, pitying and curious. Came alone, I think. I pressed my lips together. The orchestra shifted into a more dramatic overture as Camille and Preston took their positions for the official introduction as husband and wife. The MC's voice boomed from the speakers, delivering a glowing tribute written by Camille herself. He listed her achievements, her branding deals, her philanthropy work, her social media feature in Lux Living magazine. That last one made a table nearby clap with particular enthusiasm. But Preston? He didn't seem entirely present. He looked at Camille, then at the crowd, then, unexpectedly, at me. The crease between his brows deepened. His doubt was beginning to surface. Camille stepped forward for her first toast. With the poise of someone born for the spotlight, she lifted her glass and said, I owe everything to my family. Their love, their support, their guidance. I almost choked on a sip of water. Every word rang hollow. She continued, especially my mother, who taught me what true elegance looks like. Evelyn dabbed her eye with a linen napkin, pretending emotion. And of course, Camille said sweetly, casting a brief glance in my direction, my sister Ava, who, well, has always done things her own way. A few guests chuckled. Of course they did. The dig was subtle but sharp. A perfectly aimed needle. I kept my face still. The lights dimmed further as staff rolled in a screen for the love story montage. Guests oohed and ahed as photos of Camille and Preston flashed across the display. Vacations, brunches, staged candid moments, outfit-coordinated shoots. At one point, a series of childhood photos appeared, all from our home: Camille in dance recitals, Camille at Christmas, Camille blowing out birthday candles. I waited for even a single photo of the two of us together. None came. Not one. A woman behind me whispered, I didn't realize she had a sister. My fingers curled around the edge of the tablecloth. Preston's eyes flicked toward me again, this time longer, heavier. Something unsettled him. Maybe he noticed the missing pieces. Maybe he wondered why no family photo included me. Maybe he was finally beginning to see the cracks. The guests applauded as the montage faded out. Camille stepped off the stage with her bridesmaids clustered around her, all giggles and dramatic gestures. One of them, Celeste, passed close to me and whispered to another bridesmaid she didn't want Ava in the planning photos, said it would ruin the aesthetic. Her friend nodded knowingly. Camille said Ava has that chaotic energy. I didn't react. I didn't blink. But inside, a cold line of steel formed. Preston walked toward me again, pausing by my chair. I wanted to check on you, he said quietly. You don't have to, I replied. Maybe not, he said, but I feel like I should. His expression held no smugness, no false sympathy, just genuine confusion mixed with something else. Concern, maybe. Or recognition. Things seem tense, he added carefully. Tense is a generous word, I murmured. Before he could respond, Evelyn's voice rang out across the hall. Preston, Camille needs you for the family portraits. His jaw tightened. Of course she does. Then, he gave me a soft, almost apologetic nod before returning to the front. The photographer arranged everyone into a rigid formation. Evelyn stood proudly beside Camille. Douglas straightened his suit jacket. Bridesmaids arranged themselves around the couple like pastel-colored satellites. Then Evelyn scanned the hall. Her gaze landed on me. A frown tugged at her mouth. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then turned away and said loudly, We're good. Everyone's here. Everyone. Except me. I slipped farther into my chair, feeling the weight of the moment settle into place. The perfect wedding. The perfect family. The perfect facade. I looked around the room at the polished crystal, the curated elegance, the practiced smiles, and realized just how desperately they needed their glittering image to hold. And how terrified they were of the truth that would break it. The orchestra swelled again as servers brought out the first-course beet salad arranged like a piece of modern art. Guests murmured polite compliments about the presentation. I barely touched mine. Instead, I watched my sister glide from group to group, basking in every spotlight she passed under. She looked untouchable until she caught my eye again. Her expression wavered for a single heartbeat. Just one. Camille always knew when the ground under her was shifting, even if no one else sensed it yet. And tonight, she could feel the shift beginning. The truth had started waking up. The cracks were forming. And soon everything they'd tried to bury my wedding, the invitations, the silence, would stop being shadows. I smoothed my hands over my dress, grounding myself. They erased me from their photos, their speeches, their memories, but not for much longer. I stood up just as Evelyn rose for her toast, the one I knew she'd been rehearsing for weeks. The air tightened again, every detail poised like the edge of a blade. This was the last moment of calm before the storm. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. Evelyn lifted her champagne flute with the same grace she used to lift a knife. The orchestra softened behind her, dimming into a gentle hum as the spotlight followed her to the center of the ballroom. The crowd quieted, and the gold warmth of the chandeliers tightened into a single focused beam above her. My beautiful daughter, Camille, she began, her voice floating like silk dipped in sugar, has always known how to do things properly. She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't have to. The word properly ricocheted through my chest, like an old bruise being pressed. Camille beamed beside her, glowing with practiced innocence. The guests sighed, settling into their seats like they were about to watch a fairy tale staged in real time. I rested my fingers on the base of my wine glass to keep them steady. Evelyn continued, She has grace, poise, and a deep consideration for family, something I have always admired in her. Another pause. Another sidelong glance in my direction. The message couldn't have been clearer if she'd held up a neon sign that said, Unlike some people. Across the room, Preston shifted uncomfortably beside Camille. His jaw tensed, his eyes flicking again to me. He wasn't buying the polished narrative tonight. He wasn't the only one. Evelyn's smile grew tighter, sharper. And now that our youngest is happily married, she lingered on the word youngest as if savoring it. We have only one question left. My breath held. Not because I feared what she would say, but because I recognized the moment, the carefully prepared pause, the expectant hush in the hall. She had been waiting all night for this. "When's your turn, Ava?" It had the softness of a joke, and the cruelty of a scalpel. The guests reacted instantly. A ripple of murmurs, a few chuckles, a sympathetic wince from someone who didn't want to be caught staring. My cousin covered her mouth, whispering something to the man beside her. A bridesmaid smirked behind a champagne flute. Camille gasped dramatically, putting a hand to her heart. "Mother," she said with the perfect balance of chastisement and amusement. "Don't put pressure on her." Her tone implied exactly the opposite. My father Douglas didn't react with humor. He leaned forward in his seat, expression hard. "Ava," he warned under his breath, "don't start anything, of course." Because I had always been the threat. Even when I said nothing, I inhaled once slow. The air tasted faintly of white roses and expensive wine. This was a moment everyone expected to end the same way every other moment, like it had with me, shrinking me, smiling tightly, me pretending not to bleed. Not tonight. Preston watched me closely, eyes dark with curiosity, and something else, maybe concern, maybe realization. I set my napkin down. Then I rose to my feet. The whispers died instantly. I didn't rush. I didn't tremble. I didn't glance around to gauge the audience. I let the silence stretch, owning it for the first time in my life. Then I spoke. I already had my turn. The room froze. Someone gasped. Another dropped a fork. Camille blinked rapidly, her smile cracking like thin ice. Evelyn lowered her glass, an inch expression tightening into a taut line. "What?" she said, voice brittle. "I had my turn," I repeated calmly. 8 months ago." A fresh ripple of murmurs spread like wildfire. Evelyn recovered quickly, twisting her face into a look of wounded patience. "Ava, dear," she said, voice thick with implication. "You're not imagining things again, are you? Gaslighting, her favorite language. Camille clutched Preston's arm. "You're doing this on my wedding day," she whispered loudly enough for the nearest tables to hear. "Are you trying to ruin everything?" My father slammed his hand against the table, making several glasses jump. "Enough," he snapped. "Sit down and apologize to your sister." "For what exactly?" I asked, still calm. Ava, Evelyn hissed stop, but she wasn't in control of the room anymore. "Not tonight." Preston stepped forward just slightly, voice low but clear. "Ava, what are you saying?" The way he asked it, carefully, without judgment, made Camille stiffen beside him. I looked straight at Evelyn. "You didn't forget my wedding," I said softly. "You knew about it." A hush swept through the hall. Evelyn stared at me with a pinched smile. "Ava, darling, we never received any invitation." A bridesmaid whispered. "Oh my God." Another whispered back. "Is she serious?" Camille's face contorted into something between shock and disdain. "Why would you make up something like that, especially tonight?" "Because she wants attention," Evelyn said under her breath, but loud enough for the first few rows to hear. Familiar heat rose in my chest, not from shame, but from something else, clarity. Resolve. The sharp recognition of a line finally crossed. I met Evelyn's stare, refusing to break it. "You want the truth?" I asked. Evelyn stiffened. "Ava, do not." "I sent the invitations," I said before she could finish. "FedEx. Overnight. Signature required." A wave of murmurs spread across the hall again. Guests leaned closer. A man near the front cleared his throat. The wedding planner froze mid-step. Douglas forced a laugh, strained and ugly. "If you sent them and didn't hear back, why didn't you call?" "Because that was the question that revealed everything." "Because I got delivery confirmation," I said. "With a signature." The quiet in the hall snapped into something tighter, sharper. Camille's manicure dug into Preston's sleeve. "Mother," she whispered, frantically, "stop her." Evelyn stepped closer, voice trembling with fear disguised as fury. "Ava, that's enough." But I wasn't speaking to her anymore. I reached for my clutch, pulled out my phone, and slid my thumb across the screen. I didn't open anything yet. I didn't have to. The tension was thick enough to carve. Preston frowned. Delivery confirmation, he repeated. Yes, I said simply. The truth was no longer a secret, no longer buried, no longer trapped in a recycling bin behind my parents' house. Camille's face blanched as she realized what I was leading toward. You're lying, she said softly, voice trembling. You're lying. Her panic wasn't subtle anymore. I tilted my head, studying her, not cruelly but knowingly. Am I? And in that instant, right there in the center of her luxury wedding, surrounded by flowers and chandeliers and 200 people eager for a spectacle, Camille's expression cracked. Just a flicker, just a single falter. But it was enough. I straightened my shoulders. You wanted to know when my turn was, I said, voice carrying without a microphone. You all did. I held up my phone screen, still black but loaded. Prepared. Tonight, I said, you're finally going to hear the answer. Gasps erupted. A few guests leaned forward as if the entire evening had just shifted into a new dimension. Evelyn surged forward. Ava, but I cut her off with a single quiet word. No. It echoed through the hall like a crack in glass. The orchestra stopped. The planner froze. Even Camille seemed to forget how to breathe. And then I tapped a single word into my phone. Now. I hit send. The message delivered. Then read. And just like that, the air in the ballroom changed. A storm had entered the building, and the Hartley family, my family, was finally impossibly on the brink of being exposed. The ballroom didn't breathe after my message went through. It just paused, tightening around itself like a lung refusing air. For one suspended second, the chandeliers, the flowers, the crowd, they all felt frozen in a painting I was no longer part of. Then the whispers began. What did she say? Did she really say wedding? Is she serious? Her parents didn't go. Evelyn was the first to move. Her heel scraped sharply against the marble as she stepped toward me, fingers curled like she wished she could snatch the words out of the air. Ava, she hissed through clenched teeth. Stop this. Right now. It was the same tone she used when I was a child, when she caught me drawing on a fancy guest napkin or wearing Camille's dress without asking. A tone that warned of punishment, not concern. I didn't sit. I didn't apologize. I didn't lower my eyes. Across the table, Preston stared at me, not angry, just stunned. You meant your wedding, he said, voice low but audible. You really meant that? Yes, I said simply. Camille let out a shaky laugh, a sound that cracked at the edges. You're doing this on purpose, she whispered, voice trembling like she couldn't decide between outrage or tears. You're trying to ruin my night because you can't stand seeing me happy. I leveled my gaze at her. My wedding wasn't about you, she flinched. Douglas rose, suddenly pushing his chair back with a violent scrape. Enough, he snapped, pointing a stern finger at me, the same finger he'd used to silence me since childhood. If you sent invitations and didn't hear from us, you should have called. You don't make up stories in front of 200 people. Stories. As if my marriage, my ceremony, my vows were fiction. I felt something settle in me, a kind of clarity, cold and precise. The truth didn't need my rage to stand. It simply needed to be spoken. Dad, I said quietly, I didn't call because FedEx showed your signature. The package arrived. Someone signed for it. They just didn't bring it to you. The room drew in a synchronized breath. Evelyn shook her head firmly, stepping closer. Ava, sweetheart, you must be mistaken. You're remembering things wrong. That happens when I asked. Her lips pressed thin. When someone is under stress, she finished, reaching for my arm as if guiding a fragile woman back into her seat. I stepped backward out of reach. Gaslighting. Clean, rehearsed, familiar. A murmur rose from the crowd. A woman in a burgundy gown leaned toward her husband, whispering loudly. She said, remembering wrong too quickly. A man near her nodded. It didn't sound like concern. And just like that, the balance in the room shifted. Slightly. But noticeably. Camille's bridesmaids, who had been lounging in a pastel cluster, watched nervously, exchanging glances. Even the wedding planner froze mid-step, headset in hand, lips parted. But it was Preston who truly shifted the energy. He stepped forward, jaw-tight, eyes focused on Camille. "Why does she sound believable?" he asked out loud. Camille whipped toward him. "You're defending her, I'm asking a question," he said. But the question was more than enough. Tension started snapping through the hall like electricity. Evelyn straightened, her spine, voice icy. "Ava is confused. We never received anything." A waiter passing nearby paused, hesitating. "Ma'am," he said quietly. I think I saw a package with Ava's name months ago." In the utility hall, all heads turned toward him. The poor man paled. "I wasn't supposed to say anything," he whispered, stepping back as Evelyn's gaze cut like a blade. It was the wrong moment to show fear. Douglas lunged into damage control. "Young man, this isn't," but the server was already retreating as if he had touched something too hot. The whispers grew louder. Utility hall. Why would a wedding invitation be there? Did someone hide it? Camille clutched her necklace, face paling beneath the soft glow of the chandelier. "Mom," she whispered, "make her stop." "I'm trying," Evelyn snapped, which was the first honest thing she'd said all night. I lifted my chin. "What are you so afraid of?" Evelyn's expression flickered, fear, then fury, then something darker. Douglas gestured frantically to the MC. "Turn the music back on. Do something." The MC pressed buttons, but nothing happened. The sound system crackled uselessly. Preston turned to me again. "Ava," he said quietly, "do you actually have evidence?" All eyes locked onto me. I reached for my clutch, let my fingers slip beneath the clasp, and pulled out my phone. I didn't unlock anything yet. I didn't need to. Camille took a sharp step forward, her voice cracking. "If you show anything, if you share anything, I swear, Ava, I will." "You will?" what I asked softly. "Lie louder," her breath hitched. Evelyn looked between us, panic blooming across her face as she realized the situation was slipping. Douglas snapped. "Enough. This is humiliating." "For you?" I asked. He blinked. The room did too. A sharp, invisible shift clicked into place. For the first time all night, I wasn't the one who looked embarrassed. Then I said the sentence that ended the last sliver of their denial. "You didn't forget my wedding. You erased it." You could hear the chandelier hum with the silence that followed. Evelyn's face drained of color. "Ava, don't tell the truth," I asked. "No," she whispered. "Don't twist the story." Twist. The words settled like dust. Twist meant she knew the story, knew what they had done, and was begging me not to tell. Preston heard it too. His eyes widened, not dramatically, but with quiet, dawning horror. Camille saw his reaction and panicked further. "She's lying, Preston. She always," but he cut her off. "Always what?" "Always tries to be seen." Heard his voice sharpened. "Ava didn't crash this wedding. She attended it, like any sister would." Camille's entire face collapsed. The air thickened again as Douglas barked, "Ava, sit down." "I didn't. I've been sitting down my whole life," I said softly. "Tonight isn't one of those nights." Even the waitstaff froze. A bridesmaid whispered behind me. "She's not backing down." She was right. The truth had teeth now, and it was ready to bite. I brought my phone to my chest. A small notification glowed at the top, delivered. Read. Lucas was waiting. The plan was in motion. I drew in a slow breath, feeling the whole room leaning toward me, the tension drawn so tight it felt like a second skin. "You want me silent," I said, looking at each of them in turn. "You want me small. You want me erased." I stepped forward. "But tonight? You don't get what you want." The chandeliers flickered. The room inhaled. I lifted my phone. "Let's show everyone what really happened." And with that, the denial in the Hartley family finally publicly began to crack. The ballroom lights flickered as though the house itself reacted to my words. The murmurs swelled, thickening the air. A few guests craned their necks for a better view. Others clutched wine glasses a little tighter, sensing something seismic shifting beneath the shimmering surface of Camille's perfect night. 2 beats later, a sharp voice sliced through the tension. "What is going on with the screen?" someone near the tech booth called out. I turned. The massive LED display behind the sweetheart table just moments ago, looping a slideshow of Camille and Preston's engagement photos, went black. Pure, silent black. A ripple of confusion spread through the room. The wedding planner rushed toward the tech table, hair bouncing, face pale. "Reset it," she whispered harshly. "Now I'm trying," the technician said, panic rising in his voice. It's not responding." The guest closest to the stage leaned forward. Then a tiny white cursor appeared in the center of the huge black screen and began to move. Someone gasped. Camille whipped toward me, eyes wide. "Ava, what did you do?" "I didn't move. Nothing you didn't deserve." Her breath hitched. Evelyn stormed toward the tech station. "Turn that screen off. Do you hear me? Turn it off." But the cursor continued gliding across the screen, almost unbothered by human panic. "Remote access activated" appeared in the corner in clean, blocky text. A few guests actually stood up. The Sterling Lockwood executives exchanged wary glances. A man in the front row whispered, "This looks like an override." And for the first time all evening, Douglas looked genuinely afraid. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. I straightened my spine and let my voice carry steady and crystalline. "You always believed Camille unconditionally. But maybe you forgot what my husband does for a living." A wave of disbelief rolled through the hall. Whispers burst outward like sparks. "Husband? She's married. Did she really say husband 8 months ago? Oh my God." Camille clapped her hands over her ears as if she could drown me out. "Stop it. Stop lying." But the cursor on the screen said otherwise. It navigated smoothly, purposely opening a small system window that read ACCs granted. Administrator L. Hale. Preston's eyes widened slowly. "Hale," he murmured. "Your last name is Hale," I nodded. "It has been for 8 months. Camille swayed like she'd been slapped. Evelyn shot forward again, barking at the technician. "Shut that off right now." The technician recoiled. "Ma'am, I can't. It's locked." "Someone's remote controlling the system." "Impossible," Evelyn snapped. I tilted my head. "Not for a cybersecurity analyst." Boom. The phrase hit the room like a dropped chandelier. A group of guests near the bar suddenly murmured louder. Some recognizing Lucas's job title, others connecting dots, others simply realizing this wasn't a stunt, wasn't a tantrum, wasn't a cry for attention. This was planned, prepared, precise. The cursor hovered over a desktop folder labeled Hartley, Project Truth. A cold wave of silence swept through the hall. Camille covered her mouth. "No, no, no, no." Evelyn grabbed her arm. "Don't react. Do you hear me? Don't give her the satisfaction." But it was already too late. Every tiny twitch on Camille's face was broadcasted to a room full of wealthy witnesses and the Sterlings. Douglas stomped toward me. "Turn it off, Ava. Now, before you embarrass yourself further." I turned my head slowly toward him. "Embarrass myself," I echoed. "Or embarrass you," he froze. Around us, guests leaned closer like they'd stumbled into the middle of a live courtroom drama. "Well," I said softly, "let's find out." The cursor double-clicked the folder. The screen opened to reveal a list of files, hundreds of them organized neatly by date. Screenshots, digital logs, receipts, security footage, thumbnails. My evidence, my truth, organized by the man who helped me rebuild myself. "What is this?" someone whispered. "This," I said, "is everything you erased." A bridesmaid flinched visibly. The groom's mother covered her mouth. Several investors sat forward, scenting catastrophe. Evelyn stepped toward me, voice trembling with barely contained rage. "Ava, you will stop this, or what?" I asked calmly. You'll deny it again, her breath stuttered. She opened her mouth but then froze, because the cursor moved again, sliding toward a file named Fed.ex receipt 1. PDF. The room erupted into anxious whispers. Camille let out a strangled sound. Make it stop, make it stop. Preston stepped closer to her, but not sympathetically, confused, suspicious. What exactly is she about to show? Camille's eyes darted wildly. Nothing lies. But Preston didn't look convinced. The cursor paused over the file. The tension wound so tight the chandeliers themselves seemed to vibrate. Before opening it, I said clearly, before everyone sees what's in there, I want you to remember something. All eyes snapped toward me. You didn't forget my wedding. You didn't miss it by accident. You made a choice. Camille shook her head so hard her veil trembled. Liar, I met her eyes. You made sure no one ever knew it happened. Her mouth fell open. The cursor clicked. The PDF began to load. A high, thin sound broke from Camille's throat. Mom, stop her, but Evelyn looked frozen. There was something in her expression I had seen only twice in my life, once when Douglas crashed his first company, and once when Camille publicly embarrassed her at a gala. Fear. Not for me. For herself. And for the first time since I walked into that ballroom, I saw recognition dawn across the faces of the guests. Not pity, not confusion, recognition. This wasn't a meltdown. This wasn't attention-seeking. This wasn't madness. This was the truth coming home. The PDF opened. A faint thump echoed across the ballroom, maybe the sound of Evelyn's composure hitting the floor. The screen filled with a high-resolution image of a FedEx delivery slip. A signature scrawled across the bottom. C. Hartley's silence slammed into the room like a wall. Camille staggered backward. Preston inhaled sharply. Someone near the bar whispered, "Oh my God, she signed for it." I let the image linger, let the reality settle into every corner of the hall. The invitations were delivered, I said quietly. They arrived on your doorstep. They were signed for. Guests watched me like a fuse burning toward something explosive, and they were never given to my parents. I paused. Why, Camille's breath trembled, her eyes wild as she searched the crowd for anyone to rescue her. No one moved, not a soul. And I realized in that moment that the Hartleys had built their entire empire on the illusion of perfection. But all illusions end. Tonight, this one was ending beautifully. The ballroom fell into a silence, so complete it felt physical, like a velvet curtain dropping over 200 stunned guests. On the towering screen behind Camille's flower-draped arch, the FedEx receipt glowed in crisp, unforgiving detail. Her signature, C. Hartley, looped elegantly across the bottom. Not smeared, not misread, not fabricated, clear, permanent, undeniable. A man in the front row whispered, "That's her handwriting." A woman beside him nodded stiffly. She signs her brand packages the exact same way. Camille shook her head, hard curls trembling. That doesn't mean anything. It's just a delivery. I sign for everything. It was from Ava, Preston said quietly. His voice carried farther than he intended. You signed for your sister's wedding invitation. His words hit harder than the PDF ever could. Camille's face drained. Evelyn reached for her daughter's hand, but Camille pulled away, her eyes darting like a cornered animal. I stepped forward slightly, not triumphantly, not vindictively, just steady. The receipt is only the first piece, I said. There's more. The cursor moved again. The ballroom collectively held its breath. A new window opened. An email inbox. Evelyn Hartley's inbox. Perfectly organized. Perfectly color-coded. Perfectly curated. Except for one thing. At the top of the filters section, marked with a small red flag, was a rule labeled wedding block. The gasp that rippled through the hall was louder this time. The filter details popped open automatically. If subject contains Ava plus wedding, delete permanently. Skip inbox, do not archive, created February 14. Device, iPhone, Evelyn Hartley. The room erupted into whispers. Not the curious, petty ones from earlier. These were sharp, horrified. She blocked her own daughter's emails. Who does that permanently deleted? Oh, that's intentional. That's cruel. Evelyn stepped forward abruptly, flinging her arm toward the screen, like she could physically claw the evidence out of existence. This is fake, she snapped. This is manipulation. She hacked my account. You don't need to hack something you set up yourself, I said evenly. A few guests blinked at the calm in my voice. You had Camille set up your phone last Christmas, I continued. She connected your email, handled your two-factor authentication, and told you it was for security. The cursor highlighted the line that confirmed the IP address. Preston's head whipped toward Camille. You installed that filter, he asked, the words slicing through the air. Camille's voice trembled. Mom asked me to help manage her inbox. It's not what you think I didn't, Camille. His tone shifted quieter, colder. Did you delete Ava's wedding emails? Her lips parted. No sound came out. Evelyn jumped in, voice shrill. She was protecting us. Ava's wedding would have been, what embarrassing, I asked softly. My voice seemed to echo. A man from the groom's side cleared his throat. Mrs. Hartley? Is that what you meant? Evelyn froze. She hadn't realized she'd revealed more than she intended. A bridesmaid muttered. Oh, God. Camille's breath quickened. It's not like that. I was trying to spare them. The venue Ava picked was rustic. That venue I said was the one Lucas and I could afford without going into debt. Camille flinched like the truth had physical force. Besides, she added in a desperate rush, Ava always ruins events when she's emotional. A collective murmur swept through the hall. People began to frown not at me, but at her. Preston took a step away from Camille. His expression cracked open into disgust. You sabotaged her wedding, he said. On purpose. No, she cried. I was protecting them, protecting our family image. Her voice pitched upward, hysteria bleeding through. And she added, turning toward the crowd with a sweeping gesture, Ava's wedding wasn't worthy of us. The room stilled, dead quiet. Even the musicians lowered their bows as if stunned into stillness. Slowly, witnesses throughout the hall began reacting. That's awful. She said that out loud. She sounds proud of it. Who talks like that about their own sister? Camille's face crumbled. I didn't mean I just... But the cursor moved again, and the final piece of evidence opened on the giant screen. A video file. Front door, cam 12, MP4, timestamp February, 121014 a.m. It began playing automatically. The FedEx truck pulled into the frame. The driver stepped out holding a blue package, the one with the ivory ribbon invitations inside. He rang the bell. Camille answered the door. A hush swept over the hall. The video showed her smiling at the driver signing the tablet, taking the package. She read the label. Her smile vanished instantly. Then she scanned the yard, glancing left and right to see if anyone was watching. She walked toward the side of the house, toward the recycling bins. The camera angle cut to the side camera. She hurled the sealed package into the recycling bin without hesitation. No curiosity. No pause, no guilt, just disposal. The package landed with a dull thud. The video froze on Camille's face, cold, irritated, satisfied. The ballroom erupted. Voices everywhere. She threw it away. She didn't even open it. She didn't want anyone to know. Oh my God. What kind of sister? Preston stepped back from Camille like she'd burned him. You destroyed your sister's wedding, he whispered. And you would have let everyone here think she was crazy. Tears finally spilled down Camille's cheeks, not elegant pearly tears like her brand photos. These were messy, panicked, ugly. I was upset, she screamed. I wasn't thinking, you were thinking very clearly, I said. The camera footage shows that. She collapsed into her chair, sobbing into her hands. But the damage wasn't contained to her. Douglas staggered forward, pale. You recorded our home, our private entrance. I met his eyes. You hired me to install the entire smart system. The cameras, the lighting, the sensors. I gave you a 40-page manual you never read. A younger cousin whispered, so she had legal access. Yes, I answered. Evelyn swayed slightly, her voice faint. Ava, please, stop. But the crowd was no longer on her side. Not after hearing her defend Camille's sabotage. Not after seeing her filter. Not after the video. What did you think would happen, I asked. That you could erase me forever. The guests watched Evelyn as she opened and closed her mouth, searching for a story strong enough to override the truth. But lies could no longer hold shape in a room that had witnessed what we had just seen. Camille lifted her swollen face, mascara streaking. I'm sorry, she whispered brokenly. Ava, I'm sorry. But I was already moving toward the edge of the platform, my voice steady. Sorry doesn't unthrow the box. Sorry doesn't make them show up. Sorry doesn't erase how small you tried to make me. Preston spoke again, voice like steel. It erases nothing. His next gesture broke the last remaining illusion of the night. He reached for his wedding band, pulled it off, and placed it on the table beside Camille's untouched champagne glass. The sound of metal hitting glass sang through the ballroom like a final verdict. Camille stared. Evelyn's knees buckled. Douglas turned gray. And for the first time all night, I felt something close to peace. Not victory, not revenge, just truth. Finally, undeniably, unbearably true. Preston's wedding band hit the crystal table with a sharp final clink, small, metallic, almost insignificant in sound, but the impact rippled through the ballroom like an explosion. Conversations died mid-breath. A bridesmaid dropped her champagne flute. Somewhere near the back, someone whispered, "Oh God." Camille stared at the ring as if she didn't recognize it. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound came out. She looked like a porcelain doll dropped from a great height, cracked in places no one could glue back together. "You're not serious," she choked out. Preston didn't look angry. He looked disappointed in a way so deep it almost felt private. "I cannot marry someone who destroys her own sister's wedding," he said quietly, but the microphone on the stage caught his voice and sent it echoing across the hall. The guests gasped. A few people turned their faces away, unable to watch the unraveling. Camille lurched toward him. "I said I was sorry," I told her. I wasn't thinking. He stepped back, avoiding her touch like it burned. "You knew exactly what you were doing. It was just a package," she screamed. Preston's eyes hardened. It was her wedding. The orchestra fell silent. The lights seemed to dim. Or maybe everything simply looked darker now that truth was no longer hiding beneath shimmering decorations. Evelyn pushed to her feet, her face blotchy, her voice sharp with desperation. "Preston, don't be hasty. Camille made a mistake, but surely you don't intend to." "I do," he said. And there was no hesitation. Douglas slammed his hand against the table, rattling silverware. "You think you can humiliate my family like this in my house?" But Preston didn't even turn toward him. His gaze stayed locked on Camille, on the woman he had planned to build a life with, and watched as everything he believed about her shattered. "I wanted to marry a woman of integrity," he said, "not someone who would sabotage her sister out of jealousy." Camille let out a strangled cry. "That's not fair." Neither was throwing away her invitations, he said. Behind him, his father, Gregory Lockwood, rose slowly from his seat. The man's presence alone commanded silence. His white hair, immaculate suit, and hard, intelligent eyes marked him as someone accustomed to power, not apology. "Douglas," he said, voice like granite, cracking, "a man who cannot keep order in his own family cannot expect to succeed in business." Douglas's face went sheet white. "Gregory, please, we can discuss this privately." "There is nothing to discuss," Gregory said. "The merger is cancelled." The words detonated like a bomb. Several guests gasped aloud. Douglas nearly staggered. Evelyn's hand flew to her throat. "That deal was worth $40 million, someone whispered. But Gregory wasn't finished. He rested a firm hand on Preston's shoulder. My family will not be associated with a household that erases daughters and celebrates cruelty." Douglas's jaw dropped. He reached out, gripping Gregory's sleeve. "Don't do this. Don't let go, Douglas." Gregory said, shaking him off. Douglas's desperation cracked into rage. He turned on me. "This is your doing," he spat. "Your spite, your pettiness. You've destroyed your sister's future and our reputation." "My reputation," I repeated, my voice quiet but cutting. "You did that when you didn't show up to my wedding." A murmur of agreement hummed through the crowd. Camille stumbled to her feet, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "Ava, please," she sobbed. "You're ruining my life." I met her eyes. I didn't throw anything away. Her face crumpled. "You don't understand," she cried, reaching toward me. "Mom said she didn't want to fly out. Dad said your venue looked like a barn, and you picked such an odd date. What was I supposed to do? Not sabotage me," I said. "Not erase me." "I was trying to protect them," she shouted through tears. "Protect our family image." Gasps rippled through the hall. Several guests stared at her like she'd sprouted horns. Even Evelyn looked horrified. Camille stopped talking. But Camille clapped both hands to her mouth as if finally realizing what she'd admitted. Preston released a breath that seemed to carry months of disbelief and dawning clarity. "You manipulated me," he said softly. "You told me Ava wasn't close to the family. You made her sound pathetic," I supplied. He closed his eyes, ignored. Evelyn whirled on me again, panic rising in her voice. "Ava, you don't understand the pressure this family faces. Your father Camille's sponsorship deals. None of that matters more than treating your daughter like she exists," I said. The truth hung there heavy and undeniable. Gregory gave Preston a nod, signaling they were leaving. Preston didn't even look at Camille as he descended the steps from the stage. "Wait," Camille sobbed, stumbling after him. "Wait, no, please don't leave." But Preston kept walking. Gregory cast Douglas one final look. "A word of advice," he said quietly. "A man who builds his life on lies should expect collapse." Then he and his son left the ballroom without looking back. The silence that followed was suffocating. Camille collapsed into a chair, shaking. Evelyn knelt beside her, frantic. Douglas clutched the back of his own seat as if steadying himself on a sinking ship. I stood still. Not triumphant, not gloating, just tired. So tired. "You," Camille whispered, suddenly pointing a trembling finger at me. "You did this. You ruined everything." "No," I said. My voice was calm, almost gentle. "You ruined everything when you treated my life like trash." Her sobs turned raw. "I'll tell everyone you faked the emails, you hacked the cameras. I'll destroy you." "No, you won't." My tone didn't rise, but it cut through her rant like ice. "Mail tampering is a federal crime. And I have the footage. One whisper of slander about me and Dior and Cartier will be the first to see it." Camille froze, sobs strangling into silence. The realization washed over her slowly. Her empire relied on image. And the image was gone. Evelyn tried once more, reaching out as if to touch my arm. "Ava, darling, we can fix this. We can." "No," I said. "You can't." Douglas straightened, trying one last tactic. "Ava, think about your family. Think about what you're doing." "I am thinking," I replied. "For the first time, I'm thinking about myself." He swallowed hard, but the truth had already gutted him. Without the merger, his financial future was in shambles. His pride, too. I stepped closer to Camille. She flinched. On the table before her sat the cream-colored gift box she had given me earlier, the subscription to an app for desperate singles over 30. And beside it the book, How to Find Happiness When You Die Alone. Slowly, deliberately, I placed the box in front of her. "Keep it," I said quietly. "You need it more than I do." Her sob cracked into a broken sound. I turned toward the doors. The air outside the ballroom beckoned, cool, sharp, cleansing. Behind me, Evelyn called out, voice cracking. "Ava, wait. We can talk about this," but I didn't look back. The giant oak doors swung shut behind me with a heavy, echoing thud, the sound of 30 years of silence closing behind me. The December night wrapped around me like clean, cold truth. A rideshare idled at the edge of the circular drive. The driver looked at me through the mirror with a gentle nod. "Logan Airport?" he asked. "Yes," I whispered. As the car pulled away, I allowed myself one final glance at the estate. Every window blazed with light, but from here, it looked nothing like a home. Just a beautiful shell, hollow, empty, cold. My phone buzzed softly. "A call from Lucas," I answered. "Is it done?" he asked. "It's done," I breathed. "Good," he said. "Come home. Mom's making soup." And for the first time in a very long time, my chest didn't ache. It felt light, free. Cold air rushed into my lungs the moment the hotel doors swung shut behind me. It was sharp and clean, nothing like the suffocating warmth of the ballroom where 200 people had just watched my family fall apart. The marble steps glistened with frost, the faint glow of winter lights washing the courtyard in a soft silver haze. For a moment, I just stood there, still in my dress, still holding my clutch, still feeling the tremor of everything that had just happened echo through my bones. Behind the glass doors, I could still hear Camille's sobs, Douglas's raised voice, Evelyn, begging anyone to salvage what remained of the night. But the thick doors muted it, turning their chaos into background noise I no longer had to carry. My shawl slipped from one shoulder. I didn't fix it. A valet stepped toward me hesitantly. He'd seen the collapse inside. Everyone had. He cleared his throat. "Miss Hartley, do you need assistance?" "I'm fine," I said, and for once it wasn't a lie. I walked down the remaining steps, heels clacking rhythmically against the stone. At the bottom of the drive, the headlights of my rideshare blinked twice. The night felt colder than it should have, but the air tasted like freedom. "Ava," a voice cried behind me. I turned. Camille burst out of the doors, her gown dragging behind her, mascara streaking down her cheeks. She stepped onto the marble steps too fast and slipped, catching herself on the railing. You can't leave," she gasped. Her voice carried across the winter air. I held still. She staggered down 2 steps, gripping the railing with both hands. "You destroyed everything," Camille sobbed. "My wedding, my future, my life." I stepped closer, just enough for her to hear me without shouting. "I didn't destroy anything. You didn't destroy yourself. You ruined my marriage," she cried. "Preston just left. He left me. He left after watching you throw away my invitations," I said. "He left after seeing who you are." Camille shook her head violently. "He'll come back. He has to." Her gaze locked onto me, wild and furious. "You make everyone feel sorry for you," she spat. "You twist everything. I didn't twist anything I said. I showed the truth." Camille's chest heaved. "I'll tell everyone what you did. I'll tell them you hacked everything you planned." All this I let her rant until she ran out of breath. Then I stepped close enough that she felt the shift in the air. "No, you won't." Her lips parted. "Because if you do," I said softly, "that video of you throwing my wedding invitations into the recycling bin goes straight to the police and your sponsors." Her expression collapsed. "You wouldn't," she whispered. "I would," I said. "And you know it." Camille's knees buckled slightly. She clutched the railing again, mascara running in wet streaks. And maybe for the first time in her life, she understood that actions had consequences. The driver opened the back door, waiting silently. "Ava," someone yelled again. This time it was Douglas, charging out the doors, tie loose, face crimson from embarrassment and anger. He looked older, smaller, like the collapse had aged him 10 years. He stormed down the steps. "You fix this," he demanded, pointing at me. "You turn around, you go back inside, and you tell them all it was a misunderstanding." "You're asking me to lie," I said. "I'm asking you to salvage this family," he snapped. "Do you have any idea what you've done to my reputation, to my business?" There it was, his real concern. Not Camille, not my mother. Certainly not me, his reputation. My business was on the line tonight, he shouted. $40 million gone. You should be ashamed of yourself. I stared at him, not blinking. Dad, I said quietly, you didn't lose that merger tonight. You lost it when you decided your image mattered more than showing up to your daughter's wedding. The words hit him with visible force. For the first time I could remember, Douglas looked unsteady, like a man looking at a truth he'd never prepared to face. You always do this, he whispered, shaking his head. You always what I asked. Speak after years of being silent. He clenched his fists. You are ungrateful. Ungrateful. The word landed exactly where he wanted it to. But it didn't break anything this time. I'm done, I said softly. I'm done being quiet. I'm done carrying your secrets. I'm done making myself small so the three of you can shine. Douglas's face twisted with something like panic. We're family, he said, voice cracking, whether you like it or not. Family doesn't erase weddings, I replied. Camille let out something between a sob and a scream. The hotel doors opened again. Evelyn stepped out. Her makeup was smudged. Her perfect hair was wilting. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. Her voice was thin. Ava, darling, please, we can talk. Come back inside. We can fix this. There was something like genuine fear in her eyes, not for me, for the fallout. I shook my head. There's nothing left to fix. Ava, Mom, I said softly, I spent my entire life waiting for you to choose me. Tonight I realized I don't need you to. Her face crumpled, but I couldn't tell if it was from heartbreak or losing control. I turned toward the car. The driver held the door open. Miss Hale? He asked gently. Hale. My real name. My chosen family. I nodded. But before I slid inside, Evelyn whispered, Please, don't leave us. I looked back at her. You left me first, I said. Then I got into the car and closed the door behind me. The engine hummed to life, and the hotel began shrinking behind us, windows glowing brightly in the winter dark. From the distance, the estate looked perfect, grand and sparkling and beautiful. But beauty doesn't mean life. And I knew better than anyone how empty those lights really were. My phone buzzed. Lucas, I answered immediately. Is it done? He asked. It's done, I said. My voice didn't shake. I'm proud of you, he murmured. Mom's heating soup and I already queued up your favorite playlist. Come home. Come home. Not the place I was born, but the place where I was safe, where I was loved. 3 hours later, after the plane touched down in Denver, I walked into our bungalow just as dawn began brushing gold across the sky. The air smelled like rosemary and something warm simmering on the stove. Lucas wrapped his arms around me the moment I stepped in. You're okay, he whispered. I am, I said. For the first time in a long time, I really am. Later that afternoon, as I unpacked groceries in our kitchen, the mundane, gentle kind of quiet I'd never had growing up, a FedEx truck pulled up in front of our house. The driver jogged toward our porch with a flat box under his arm. For a moment, my breath caught. Then I opened the front door. He handed me the box. Signature required. The label read Douglas Hartley, my father. My fingers tightened around the cardboard. Lucas appeared beside me. Do you want me to open it? I shook my head. I should. Inside was a check for $50,000. $50,000, the price of my silence. The note attached typed impersonal read, I'm sorry. Please stay quiet about the contract. Just one line. Not a single mention of my wedding. Not a single acknowledgement of the 8 months of silence. Not a single sign of remorse. Just money, just fear. I stared at the check long enough for clarity to settle like dust. The Ava from a year ago would have cried. The Ava from a year ago might have accepted. The Ava from a year ago still believed she could earn her family's love. But she was gone. Without a word, I tore the check down the center. Then into quarters. Then into tiny confetti pieces until no number, no name, no debt of silence remained. Lucas watched, his eyes soft. You okay? He asked. Yes, I said. This time, yes. I laid the shredded pieces on the granite counter, arranged them neatly, and lifted my phone. The family group chat still existed. 3 members. 3 ghosts. I took a photo of the torn check and typed, "I don't sell my silence. This is my last message. Do not contact me again." I hit send. Delivered. Read. I didn't wait for replies. I scrolled to the top of the chat, tapped settings, and pressed leave group. "Are you sure?" "Yes," I whispered. And when the screen dimmed, leaving nothing of the Hartley family behind, a quiet settled in my chest, a steady, gentle quiet that felt like the beginning of a new life. Rain swept across the Denver streets in long, silver streaks the night everything finally ended. It wasn't a dramatic thunderstorm, not the kind that shakes windows or floods gutters. It was quieter than that. A steady, cleansing rain that whispered against the roof of our bungalow, tapping gently on the windows like someone knocking softly to ask, "Are you all right in there?" Inside, our house glowed warm with lamplight. Lucas was in the kitchen sautéing something fragrant, garlic, herbs, butter, while soft jazz drifted from the speaker by the sink. I curled up on the living room couch blanket, pulled over my legs, a steaming mug of lemon tea cupped between my palms. For the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel oppressive. It felt earned. I exhaled slowly, letting the warmth seep into the places that had been tense since childhood. The ache behind my ribs wasn't gone yet, but it was softer now. No longer sharp punishment, just healing tissue. Lucas peeked around the corner. "You're thinking," he said, leaning against the doorway in a way that made him look like home personified. "I'm always thinking." He smiled. "But this sounds like the heavy kind. Want to talk?" I shook my head. "Not yet." "All right," he said gently. "Dinner'll be ready in 10. He disappeared back into the kitchen, and I let my gaze drift toward the window. Rain streaked the glass. Reflections shimmered on the driveway. The world outside looked blurred, softened like someone had dipped the entire neighborhood into watercolor. My phone buzzed once on the coffee table. It wasn't a notification. It wasn't a message. It was an alert, a missed call, from a number I knew by heart even though I'd deleted it. Evelyn. The screen flashed again, another call, then another. I let it ring without touching it. When the buzzing stopped, a voicemail icon appeared. Then another, then 3 more. I didn't listen to any of them. Instead, I turned the phone face down and tucked deeper into the blanket. But the past has a way of sneaking inside, no matter how many locks you put on the door. And part of me already knew they weren't calling to apologize. Not really. They were calling because their world was collapsing, and without my silence they couldn't stitch it back together. A knock sounded at the door. I startled. Lucas stepped into the living room, expecting someone new. We shared a look equal parts wary and curious. He opened the door, and my mother stood there. Her hair was damp from the rain, her coat soaked through at the shoulders. Mascara smudged faintly beneath her eyes. She wasn't wearing her pearls, something I'd never seen before. Evelyn Hartley always wore pearls. They were her armor, her signature, her reassurance to the world. I am composed. I am curated. I am in control. But tonight she looked human. "May I come in?" she asked quietly. Lucas stepped back, glancing cautiously at me. Avi pulled the blanket tighter around my legs but nodded. Evelyn stepped inside, blinking at the warmth, the softness, the smallness of our house. She had always called our home choices quaint in a condescending tone. Tonight she didn't say anything. She just stood there, dripping lightly onto the entryway rug. "I tried calling," she said. "I know, you didn't answer." Her voice trembled, though she tried desperately to hide it. "I didn't." She looked at her hands, trembling slightly, then lifted her chin. "Your father is unraveling," she said. Lucas shot me a look that said, "Is this really what she opened with?" I calmly sipped my tea. "I'm sure he is." "This merger wasn't my doing," I interrupted softly. "It was his own choices." Evelyn swallowed. The rain pattered harder outside. I came, she said after a moment, because I need you to understand something. Lucas shifted closer, protective. But her next words surprised even him. I was wrong. Everything stilled. The house. The rain. The breath in my chest. Evelyn clasped her hands together tightly. I was wrong about you, about the wedding, about how I treated you. Her voice cracked. She pressed a hand to her temple briefly. These past few days, I keep replaying it. What I said, what I didn't say, what I convinced myself was acceptable because it was easier. I didn't speak. She drew a shaking breath. I lost my daughter, she whispered, and I did it with my own hands. Shock rippled through me. Evelyn wasn't dramatic. She wasn't emotional. She certainly wasn't self-critical. Yet here she was, standing in my doorway like a woman stripped of every layer she'd ever worn. I don't expect forgiveness, she said. I don't expect anything. I just needed you to hear me say it. Out loud. Without excuses. Her gaze flicked up. Without lies. Without Camille. I'm sorry. The words hung between us, delicate and raw. A younger version of me, the girl who used to sit on the stairs, listening for the sound of my parents' approval, would have crumbled at those words, would have run into her arms, desperate to believe she was seen, loved, chosen. But the woman I had become, the one who built a new life brick by brick with Lucas by her side, felt something different. Sadness, yes. Relief, maybe, but not longing, not need. I appreciate the apology, I said quietly. And I meant it. But things won't go back to the way they were, she nodded quickly. I know. And I won't be pulled into that house again. Her throat bobbed. I know. And I won't forget what happened. Her eyes glistened. I don't deserve for you to. We stood there in silence, the air thick with everything said and unsaid. Finally, she stepped back toward the door. I won't call again, she said softly. I just wanted you to know. When she turned the handle, she paused. You looked strong that night, she whispered. Stronger than I ever taught you to be. Lucas taught me, I said. My mother closed her eyes for a moment, something between grief and gratitude, mixing in her expression, then nodded and stepped into the rain. Lucas closed the door slowly. The house felt steadier somehow. He turned to me. How do you feel? I placed my tea down, considering the question honestly. I feel free, I said. He smiled softly. Good, you deserve that. Later that night, curled up in bed beside him, I listened to the rain fade into quiet, the storm finally passing. I didn't feel guilt, or regret, or grief for the life I'd left behind. I felt something simpler, something lighter. Like the world had finally stopped asking me to shrink. And for the first time, I drifted to sleep without bracing for impact. The first morning of the new year arrived quietly, slipping into our bedroom as a soft wash of golden light that stretched across the comforter. I blinked awake to the gentle hum of the heater and the steady rhythm of Lucas's breathing beside me. Outside, the world was muted in that peaceful way. Only winter mornings can be: no cars, no voices, just the hush of snow settling deeper onto rooftops and branches. For a moment I stayed still, letting the calm settle into me. No anxiety clawing at my ribs, no dread about a message from my parents, no fear of what disaster might be waiting in the Hartley house. Just the warmth of a home I chose with a man who chose me back. Lucas stirred, rolling onto his side, eyes still heavy with sleep. Morning, he murmured. Morning, I whispered. He brushed a thumb across my cheek. You slept through the night. I know, I said, surprised even saying it out loud. I didn't think I remembered how. He smiled softly. That's what healing feels like. We both knew healing wasn't a neat linear path. Some nights would still ache, some days would still sting. But the difference now was that the pain no longer controlled me, no longer defined me. It was simply a piece of what I survived. After breakfast, we bundled up and stepped outside into the crisp winter air. Snow blanketed everything, soft and untouched. The sky was a pale early blue, the kind that promised a quiet day. We walked down the street, hand in hand, boots crunching against the snow-packed sidewalk. A couple of neighbors waved. A dog chased its own breath in the frosty air. Children built crooked snowmen near the park. Nothing about this street screamed wealth or prestige. No marble columns, no chandeliers dripping from vaulted ceilings, no society elites watching from behind tinted windows. But every porch held warmth. Every window glowed with real life. Every door felt like it belonged to someone who mattered. I breathed in the scent of cedar smoke drifting from a nearby chimney. This, I said, is home. Lucas tightened his grip on my hand. It always was. Around noon, we drove to his parents' house for their traditional New Year's lunch. The moment I stepped through the door, his mother enveloped me in a warm hug that smelled like rosemary and freshly baked rolls. "Honey," she said, cupping my face, "you look brighter." "I feel brighter," I admitted. She kissed my forehead. "Good. That girl of mine deserves a year filled with peace." We crowded around the dining table, his parents, his sister, her husband, the kids, and everything felt so effortlessly loving that my throat tightened. Not painfully, but with something like gratitude. Halfway through dessert, Lucas's nephew spilled grape juice. His mother sighed. His grandmother laughed. And just like that, the moment passed, with nobody making anyone feel small or ashamed. I didn't say it out loud, but I thought it. This is what family feels like. Not perfection, not performance, just love. Later, we stepped out onto the back porch, where the last pale streaks of sunlight glowed behind the mountains. I leaned against the railing, watching the sky. Lucas slipped his arms around my waist. "Where's your head?" "Thinking about how far I've come," I said, "and how far I want to go." He kissed the top of my head. "Where do you want to go?" "Forward," he laughed softly. "Good direction." "I mean it," I said. I spent so many years chasing people who wouldn't chase me back, trying to earn space in a family that never intended to give it, and now, I don't feel that need anymore. "That's growth," he said. "That's freedom," I corrected. Snowflakes began drifting down again, swirling in the fading light. I closed my eyes and let one melt against my cheek. For the first time in my entire life, I wasn't bracing for the next disappointment. I wasn't waiting for the next attack. I wasn't arranging my entire identity around the opinions of people who only valued me when I was silent. I was living. And I was finally beginning to live for myself. When the first stars appeared, Lucas rested his chin on my shoulder. "Do you think you'll ever talk to them again?" I considered it honestly, without bitterness. "Maybe someday," I said, "if they ever truly change. Not for their image, not for convenience, but because they become people capable of loving without conditions." "And if they don't," he asked, "then I still have everything I need," I said simply. "Because I have you. I have this home. I have a life I built on truth instead of pretending." He kissed my cheek, and I leaned into him, watching tiny flakes of snow dust the porch railing. The past wasn't erased, but it no longer owned me. The rain, the storm, the collapse, all of it washed me clean. What remained was stronger, wiser, calmer, whole. That night, curled up beside him on our couch, hot chocolate between our hands, I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who tied velvet ribbons on invitations for a family that never intended to show up. The one who painted little wooden plaques for empty chairs. The one who waited with hope so fragile it cracked beneath the weight of silence. She didn't disappear. She evolved. She rose. She chose herself. And because she did, I'm here now, finally living a life shaped by love, not longing. If you followed my story all the way to this moment, thank you, truly. I hope you stay with me for the next one, because every story we tell together reminds someone out there that they're not alone. If this journey moved you or made you think or made you feel anything at all, don't forget to like this video, leave me a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. I can't wait to share more with you. After all, this is only the beginning.